It's my privilege to introduce Ambassador Nhlapo today. I'll read you a few paragraphs from the information about him on the South African Embassy website and then add a few more things. It says here, during the difficult period of struggle against apartheid, Ambassador Nhlapo made a significant contribution to the liberation movement. He began his activities as a student in the Black Consciousness movement, and together with the late Steve Biko and others co-authored the publication Black Review in 1972 that reviewed the activities of black organizations at the time. In 1973, a banning order was issued against him, and he went into exile in Botswana and then later Zambia in 1974. During his years in exile, he became a deputy editor of the ANC publication Seshaba, head of the ANC youth section and other structures of the ANC. And implicit in that, the beginning of that biography is the fact that Ambassador Nhlapo has spent his entire life really in the service of the nation of South Africa. For several decades, he was in exile, working for the equality of all peoples in the country. Was exiled for more than 2 decades outside of his country at great personal danger to himself. And then since the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, has also played a distinguished role in the development of the new government and in its relations with the outside world. He first was the South African ambassador to Ethiopia, where he had responsibility not only for that country, but as well for Djibouti, Eritrea, and Sudan, other countries in the Horn of Africa. He's been involved in negotiations and peacemaking attempts and other important affairs in the DRC, and Lesotho, and the Comoros, and Zimbabwe, all the nations of the Great Lakes region in Africa. And most recently, of course, he has been serving for about 18 months as the South African ambassador to the United States, posted in Washington, D.C. He is a personal friend of Nelson Mandela and many of the other great heroes of recent South African history. It's with great pleasure that we welcome him here to BYU, and I'm pleased at the great turnout for his lecture today.
Thank you, Professor Burns, for that introduction. Members of the Brigham Young University faculty and staff, students, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly a great privilege and honor for me to address you today as part of the 2009 Ambassadorial Lecture Series at Brigham Young University. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my special thanks to Dr. Cecil Samuelson and to Ms. Anne Santini for inviting me to participate in this important forum. Ongoing discourse is crucial, and it is only through endeavors such as these that we will get to understand and learn from each other. Today, I will be speaking to you on the topic entitled South Africa Today, Challenges and Opportunities. My objective during this speech is not to underestimate the scope and nature of the challenges that confront South Africa, but rather to talk openly and honestly of them, and of the programs and systems that the South African government has in place to manage a country recognized as one of the most diverse societies in the world. We normally refer to our country as a world in one country where everything is possible. In his State of the Nation address in May 1994, former President Nelson Mandela spoke of the post-apartheid government commitment to constructing a people-centered society in South Africa, and emphasized in this regard that the single most important challenge was to establish a social order in which the freedom of the individual would truly mean the freedom of the individual. He went on to explain that this did not necessarily mean only political freedoms, but included, amongst others, freedom from want, freedom from hunger, and freedom from deprivation. ladies and gentlemen, South Africa's liberation in 1994 was truly one of the most spectacular and iconic moments in human history. However, as the new government started rolling up their sleeves to begin tackling the challenges facing the country, they found that in addition to inheriting statutory entrenched discriminatory laws, they had also inherited a weak economy with high levels of public debt, chronic unemployment, high tariff protection, low levels of competitiveness, and no foreign investment of note. Confronted by this reality, the newly formed democratic government had to embark on a mammoth task of rebuilding the economy. The objective of that time was to move the economy onto a higher growth path, to increase its competitiveness and efficiency, and finally to reduce poverty and persistent inequalities. To that end, South Africa developed sound macroeconomic policies which ensured that our economy grew at unprecedented levels over the past 15 years. And while I am pleased to inform you that South Africa's economic growth averaged 3% per year from 1994 to 2004, and then jumped to 5% from 2004 to 2007, we are also only too aware that the benefit of such growth are not always equitably shared amongst the majority of South Africans. Since 1994, the South African government adopted specific policies aimed at ensuring a better life for all. However, in spite of its sustained offensive, the widespread poverty and gross imbalances in levels of development and the distribution of wealth, income and opportunity that still exists remains cause for great concern. As part of its broader anti-poverty strategy, the South African government has launched a War Against Poverty initiative last year. This initiative seeks to identify specific households and individuals in dire need and to put in place interventions to help alleviate their plight. It brings together government departments as well as non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, and business to identify the interventions required in specific households and to implement them as a matter of urgency. Government is also engaged in public consultation to finalize an anti-poverty strategy, which seeks to create specific economic opportunities for the historically marginalized and to empower those individuals and communities to access these opportunities. While the strategy identifies labor-intensive formal activities and a substantial expansion in public employment schemes as specific measures to create economic opportunities, it also points to education and skills development as playing a significant role in preventing the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We recognize that education is critical to help break the vicious cycle of poverty, but face a huge challenge on this front. Indeed, 15 years after our democracy, we are still grappling with the challenge of creating an education and training system that will fulfill our vision of opening the doors of learning and culture to all. Part of the government's response to the issue of education has been in the form of financial commitment. Indeed, the government's contribution to public education remains the single largest investment, since we are all well aware that it is the key to reducing poverty and accelerating long-term economic growth. And while we still have a long way to go, I am pleased to tell you that our interventions have shown some dividends. In the education sector, we have seen almost universal access in terms of enrollment at the primary school level, as well as an improvement in the number of students passing mathematics. Ladies and gentlemen, These are challenges that lie on other fronts, including health, specifically HIV and AIDS, housing, unemployment, and a huge skills shortage. It is not my intention to gloss over these challenges, but to tell you in honesty that the South African government has programs in place to address each and every one of the challenges that confront us as South Africans. We believe that it is the ability to respond to crisis that is the critical difference between societies that succeed and those that fail. Progress does not come from having no challenges. Rather, it comes from responding successfully to those challenges. I am also not here to talk to you only about the challenges that exist in South Africa. I would also like to talk to you about South Africa as a country of remarkable beauty and enormous potential and opportunity. South Africa, as many of you know, is a very rich country in natural resources. With only 6% of its population, South Africa produces 45% of the gross national product of sub-Saharan Africa. Road, rail, airport and telecommunication infrastructure is world-class and surpasses, in some instances, infrastructure in parts of North America and Europe. The most important export contributors to the economy include the mining sector, manufacturing, and agriculture. South Africa has become an increasingly popular tourism destination. Indeed, tourism is now termed the new gold in that it contributes 8% to our GDP, as much as gold. Automobile manufacturing contributes to almost 8% of the total economy. Vehicle assembly plants, Volkswagen, General Motors, Ford, BMW, Mercedes, and Nissan, and many others are represented in South Africa. These plants provide vehicle part exports of the highest quality to countries across the world. Opportunities for South African imports and investment exist in many fields, including agro-processing, automotive components, chemicals, tourism, textiles and clothing, and many, many more. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is now gearing up for what will be one of the most significant opportunities, not just for South Africa, but for the entire African continent. In June 2010, South Africa will host the FIFA Soccer World Cup. As the host, South Africa stands not as a country alone, but rather as a representative of Africa and as part of the African family of nations. The South African government views the World Cup as a significant economic opportunity, not just for South Africa, but for the entire African continent, and is using the hosting of this event as part of the country's extensive program aimed at pursuing faster economic growth and achieving its development goals. The government is also collaborating with African countries on a number of 2010 related projects in the context of an African legacy program. Before I conclude, I would like to say a few words on the current economic crisis that the world has been plunged into. South Africa, like the rest of the world, is grappling to come to terms with the effects of this global crisis. And while we have been less severely affected than many other countries, there is no way that we can say that we can escape the recession unscathed. Dysfunctional financial markets, falling equity and housing prices, and job losses globally are lessening the demand for commodities and manufactured goods that form the backbone of our industry. Several sectors, including mining, manufacturing, textiles, retail trade, and residential construction, have retrenched workers, and the pace of job losses may accelerate even further. South Africa's economic growth for 2008 slowed to 3.1% and is likely to slow even further to 1.2% in 2009, the lowest rate since 1998. However, we anticipate our output growth to improve in 2010 through a culmination of several interventions, including South Africa's public infrastructure spending, lower interest rates, and the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and a recovery in the world economy. I would like at this point to say a few words on our infrastructure program. South Africa has in place among the biggest stimulus package in the world in the form of the Expanded Works program adopted in November 2003. The Expanded Public Works program is a nationwide program that aims to draw significant numbers of unemployed into productive work, accompanied by training so that they increase their capacity to earn an income. This program contains the third biggest infrastructure spending program, behind only those of the US and China. According to economists Stephen Ho and Chiao Wu, when you consider infrastructure investment as a percentage of GDP, South Africa ranks the highest, almost 5 times that of Saudi Arabia, placed second. Spending has been pouring into the economy in the form of this program. As a result of such infrastructure investment and investment in poverty alleviation programs, the South African economy has been protected to some extent from the global economic crisis. In order to further minimize the impact of the global financial crisis on the South African economy, government, business, and labor met recently to finalize an economic response plan. This plan includes a national jobs initiative to limit job losses, sustained infrastructure spending, finding bridging funding for troubled sectors, and giving retrenched workers speedy access to unemployment payments and further skills training. Ladies and gentlemen, we are nowhere near out of the woods in spite of the large-scale infrastructure program, but we will continue to work towards protecting those in need, creating employment, investing in infrastructure, and promoting competitiveness and fiscal sustainability. In so doing, we hope to further insulate ourselves from the collapsing global markets. To conclude, while the South African government has made significant strides over the past 15 years in trying to create a society that is just and equitable, in many ways we have only just begun this journey. Our work is still work in progress. We need to build on these constructive efforts in continuing to move forward from our painful past. In his 1994 biography entitled Long Walk to Freedom, former President Mandela had this to say, and I quote, "I have walked a long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way, but I have discovered the secret that after climbing a hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended." Close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, our walk has not ended, and we have many hills to climb. But as South Africans, we know the recipe for success. And whatever challenges lie ahead, we are moving forward as one nation, a kaleidoscope of colors, cultures, and origins, ready to overcome them. I would also like to take this opportunity to invite those of you to the FIFA World Cup in South Africa next year, and to leave with you with these words, Kinako, which means it's time, which is the 2010 official slogan, which means exactly what I've said. The time in South African language is Sesotho and Setswana. South Africa is ready and stand ready to welcome you in 2010, and whatever we believe will be, and to what we believe will be one of the best cups, World Cups ever. I'm sure as many of you are aware, the United States will also be participating in June this year in the Confederations Cup. You are also, if you can make it, come and share your team and hope for the best. But I can tell you the competition is quite tough. Only the best will win. Thank you very much.
His Excellency is agreed to take some questions. We have 2 roving microphones, and so it's a fairly large room, but also for the podcasting, if you could raise your hand and please tell us your name and what you're studying, and then you can ask your question. Do you have any questions?
My name is Andre Brummer. I'm a BYU alumni. My question is with regard to Zimbabwe. There's a grave humanitarian crisis going on there at the moment, brought about by the policies of the government of Robert Mugabe. Now, realistically, the only country in the world that can exert enough influence on Zimbabwe to bring about meaningful change is South Africa. Up to date, they followed a policy of quiet diplomacy, which has not resulted in improvement for the lot of the common Zimbabwean. So my question to you is, what can or should South Africa do to help bring about change in Zimbabwe?
I think the people of Zimbabwe have answered that question. We do have today in place a unity government, a government that is composed of the ruling party, ZANU-PF, the movement for democratic change of Morgan Tsvangirai, and the movement for democratic change of Professor Atta Mutambara. These parties have engaged in negotiations and signed an agreement to form this unity government. The ministers have been sworn in, and I think they've gone down to the business of trying to make sure that this particular process can work. Because indeed, at the end of the day, all of us can do whatever we can. It is the people of Zimbabwe, at the end, who will have to find each other and solve the problem. We can only do what we've been doing up to now, supporting them in the process of engagement to identify obstacles to the solutions that they've always been desiring to have. As you might be aware, South Africa has been very much involved in reaching out to the parties in Zimbabwe to negotiate settlement to their problems. Because one of the things that we have come to realize with the parties in Zimbabwe had come to accept as a problem is that they could not have an election whose results would be acceptable. And therefore, some of the obstacles that had to be identified in clearing the playing field, as it were, became the centerpiece of those negotiations. And those obstacles were identified. And solutions were arrived at, which were resulted in the amendment of the Constitution to ensure that those obstacles are removed. And that's why, as a result, we're able to have an election in Zimbabwe whose results were not contested, save for the fact that you could not have in the presidential elections a candidate who would get more than the threshold of 50.1%. And therefore it was supposed to, and there was a runoff which created its own problems in the fact that the opposition then refused to participate in that runoff. Now, in terms of the comprehensive peace agreement that they have in place today, it constitutes a set of agreements that they've made in the process of engagement and negotiations, lasting a period of more than about 2 years, in what has been condemned as quiet diplomacy. Now, I've not known of any diplomacy, particularly in relation to conflict resolution, where you get involved in that process and without the permission of the parties, and then go out and say anything about what is happening, let alone condemning whoever might be an obstacle in that process. Because if you are involved in negotiations, you have to assume a position and a posture that allows you to reach out and be able to engage the parties and build their confidence to an extent that they can be able to find each other and find solutions to the problem. Indeed, there are many initiatives that are taken in this world. And diplomacy by its very nature constitutes of many quiet processes where governments and other stakeholders get involved in behind the scenes, if one might use that point, consultations and discussions, pressure that is put on parties and encouragement for them to find a way out of their problem. Because if we look at the problem of Zimbabwe different from what it is, and the involvement of our country and SADC and the African Union in that process, there's nothing else but the conflict resolution process. And in conflict resolution, there are certain things that you cannot do if you hope to succeed. And one of them is to take sides. You know, it's like a marriage counselor. You cannot counsel a couple that is in trouble and go about shouting about what is happening within that process. You do it quietly, and even after they've resolved the problem, you are not entitled to go about and talk about those things, because it's a very difficult moment and a difficult process that people have gone through. And one of the things that people don't take into account in relation to the situation in Zimbabwe is that the people who presided over its prosperity are the same people living in face and name who have presided over its decline. And they cannot find any joy in that. So clearly there is a problem. And the parties in Zimbabwe and the leadership of the political parties in Zimbabwe came to the conclusion that they have to work together to try and find a solution that will help them extricate that country from the situation that it is facing today. And that is precisely what they are doing. We are going to continue to support them and help them in whatever way we can, together with all the other countries in our region, to make sure that Zimbabwe succeeds. Because if Zimbabwe doesn't, then we, as South Africa in particular, continue to feel the brunt of the conflict there and the crisis in Zimbabwe. So it's also in our interest to make sure that Zimbabwe does succeed. And I know in many cases where people are talking about pressure, others have qualified it. I'm not saying you're implying the same thing. People have been saying that we should use our economic and military might to prevail over Zimbabwe. Others have gone even to the extent of saying we should invade Zimbabwe and effect some form of regime change. That's not going to happen. We are not going to do that. We'll continue on the path that we have been doing things up to now. And at the end of the day, we leave it up to the people of Zimbabwe to decide what to do with their country. And I'm sure those who know Zimbabwe Zimbabwe's got a lot of very talented, educated people, perhaps even more than South Africa, who are very capable if brought within a framework of tranquility and stability to make that country work again. And we shall continue to encourage them to do so. And I think that's what most of us are trying to do. Those who want to wait and see, it's fine. We cannot force anybody to jump in. But for us, it's not a matter of choice. These are our neighbors. And if your neighbor's house is on fire, we don't dance. You try to find a way of helping, because that fire can go and affect your own house. And that's the approach that we're adopting. Sorry for the long answer, but I thought it was important to deal with the various aspects of the Zimbabwean problem, the way we see it.
My name is Adam Harris. I'm studying political science and economics. My question is concerning the elections that are coming up in April, with the breakoff of the COPE party from ANC and the running of Jacob Zuma as president of the ANC, and the threats of violence from some of his supporters, given that in the event that he does not win. I was just kind of wondering your opinions of the COPE breakoff, the upcoming elections, and what you're expecting, and if it can hopefully follow the trend of free, fair, and safe elections in South Africa.
Indeed, there is a party called the Congress of the People, which emerged from within the ANC. The people who left the ANC because they were not satisfied with a number of processes in which the direction in which the party was taking, and opted out to form what is called the Congress of the People. Up to now, and I think until yesterday, they were still struggling to come to an agreement as to who will be the face of the party in this election, which is understandable, because born in the heat of the moment and on the eve of an election, it's not easy to establish an organization from nowhere. And you can't depend, as they had done, on people who are dissatisfied for one reason or another with the happenings within the ANC to cross over and join them. This has not happened in the massive way in which they had predicted. But certainly, it's something that the ANC, I think, in the beginning underestimated. But they had to come to their senses and take this new development seriously and engage them as an opposition. Because it is important in politics to distinguish between political enemies and opponents. They were almost treated like political enemies in the beginning, because understandably nobody expected this to happen. And particularly certain individuals that were key in the ANC to break away at the time and in the manner in which they did. But with time, I think a dust settled. All sorts of interventions took place, including the Independent Electoral Commission itself, reminding the parties about its responsibilities and what is necessary to happen in the process of campaigning. So all the parties are campaigning. They've unveiled their manifestos. They've just produced their lists, and I think most of them, those that are ready to contest, they've given their list and registered with the Independent Electoral Commission by 5 o'clock on Monday. That was the deadline. So the lines are drawn. And I was just saying that there was just a little technical issue of whether for the new party they can have two faces rather than one, as part of the attempt in the ballot paper. So one of the issues that we're trying to resolve. Quite a number of challenges that they are faced with, but other people have hailed this as a healthy development, in that an opposition coming out of the ANC itself might begin to shake up the ANC in a particular way and maybe reduce its own a percentage in terms of the seats that might control in parliament. But everybody agrees that the ANC is going to win, although there are suggestions that with a slight majority than before, the ANC itself is saying that it will do better, if anything. Parties always make whatever statements because it's political campaigning. And I think at the end of the day, it is the electorate that will decide. The people are going to vote. And we believe that, as in the past, the results will be acceptable by all of us, by all the parties. What you are insinuating about the possibilities of violence breaking out if Jacob Zuma does not win, Jacob Zuma is not contesting as an individual. If he loses, he can only lose as a candidate of the ANC to parliament, which will then vote on the president. If he loses the vote there, that's when he loses as an individual, and the ANC would have lost itself, but it will depend on the numbers within parliament, because at the end of the day, it's numbers that is going to determine the outcome of that vote, because the president is voted by parliament. From the parties that have made the threshold and are in parliament, they have the right to field in candidates for the position of president. And for now, Jacob Zuma is the candidate of the ANC, despite some of the problems, legal problems that he is faced with. But constitutionally, there is nothing that disallows him from doing so. Now, what we have described as a possible violence coming from his support base, from what I've explained, I think that is not possible. There shouldn't be, because as I'm saying that it's the numbers that they will be able to garner in the election process and the numbers that we'll have in parliament which will determine the outcome in terms of the election of the president. If they did not do well, then they'll have to review from the process of the list building right up to the point of the very election itself. And I think we all hope that when that time comes, as in the past, the result will be an acceptable one. And for the first time, we might have a contest which we have never had before, except for the election of the interim president. There's never been a contest for that position. But this time there might be. And the numbers will determine what happens.
Hi, my name is Christy Gray. I'm studying nothing here now. I'm applying to grad school in international development. I actually want to return to the earlier question about Zimbabwe. I spent 6 months in DC working directly with various sub-Saharan African countries in peace and conflict resolution. So I certainly understand that it's a difficult thing to be involved in. However, at the same time, I think that this is not a new conflict, and the quiet diplomacy that you were referencing has not really done a whole lot of good. It hasn't. We haven't seen a great deal of progress due to that. Various countries, including the United States, countries in Europe and in Africa, and even Nelson Mandela himself has criticized kind of South Africa's approach to Mugabe, and who many term as a dictator. My question is, when the rest of the world sees it so obvious that South Africa needs to do more, why is South Africa still not stepping up to the plate in that? Quiet diplomacy isn't working. And if it continues not to work, what is South Africa planning to do to aid in this humanitarian crisis?
I'm surprised that you're saying that it hasn't worked and that continues not to work. When the whole of this international community acclaimed the March 29th election as the first election in Zimbabwe that was free and fair, and an election whose results were acceptable. The March 29th election. And that's the reference point for most of the people who find the subsequent runoff unacceptable. And that was a product of this very same quiet diplomacy. I think the danger about qualifying diplomacy in a particular way and placing a curse on that process is what creates a problem, because beyond that people don't see the good of what is happening. Now, I've said earlier, and I'm going to insist on that one, it is the responsibility of the people of Zimbabwe to solve their problem. They created it. They can solve this problem. And they have agreed on a particular path to solve the problem with our support. And we will continue to support that direction. Now, the leader of the opposition, who is now Prime Minister, is himself saying that they need to make this thing work. Why should the rest of the world say that it shouldn't work? It must not work. Somebody must make sure that it doesn't work, and that role is being assigned to South Africa. Why is it that anybody and everybody else think that they love Zimbabwe more than the Zimbabweans themselves? And that if Zimbabweans embark on a particular path, why not give them a chance and support them on the path that they've embarked on? Encourage them to do the best out of this difficult situation and find a solution. We find it very disturbing that certain powerful countries have arrogated themselves the responsibility to say, if we are not satisfied about the process and the outcome of that process, we are not going to recognize it or support it. But the actors in Zimbabwe are engaging and are saying, yes, it is difficult. Yes, we want to make it well. Yes, please give us your support. And you say, no, we're not going to do that, because we don't believe that we are doing the right thing. What is the right thing? The right thing is to remove Mugabe. But the people of Zimbabwe have not done so up to now. And if we believe in democratic processes, let those institutions which exist in Zimbabwe continue to be strengthened, which is what this unity government is supposed to do. Work towards an election, deliver an election in which the people of Zimbabwe will have spoken, and begin to tackle all the problems and find whatever solutions they deem fit. And on that basis, then we give them the necessary support. There is no way that any policy, undemocratic policies like regime change, can be entertained. It's undemocratic, and if people want to move on a path of democracy and are guided by their own constitution, because there is nothing that the Zimbabweans have done in the process of these negotiations which has not translated, all the decisions, which have not translated into an amendment of their own constitution to make sure that it is in fact in law and that they preserve their constitutional democracy. And that's the path that we need to encourage. The rule of law must be the rule of law, whether you like the outcome or not. It's got to be supported. It's a principle that I think we need to be fair on and we need to be just upon. It should not be based on whether you like somebody or not. Because if you adopt that approach, you are not going to be able to solve any problem. You are certainly not going to be able to solve any problem. And I can assure you, let me give you once again the assurance. Unlike the apartheid regime in the past, which used its economic and military might to destroy the economies of the region and kill its people. This particular government is not going to do that. We're not going to do it. It's against our own principles, it's against our own history, it's against our own experience, and it's against international law. You can't say because you don't like your neighbor, then you have the right to invade and remove that person. It can't work. And I can tell you without any shadow of doubt that if anything happens to President Mugabe today, that will not be a solution to the problem of Zimbabwe. Don't look at the individual, look at the problem. Let's find the solutions where they matter and not outside of the process and where the solutions can work. It's a very difficult thing, but it's something that all of us have got to come to terms with and come to understand. It's not been an easy thing for us. It's been a very, very, very difficult thing. We were alone for a long time in this whole process of what is now condemned as quiet diplomacy. When everybody else was busy with their own things, we soldiered on because we knew the importance of ensuring that there's peace and stability in Zimbabwe because it was in our own interest. And we will continue to do that. And if people don't really understand that, I think we'll leave it to the next generations. Because our generation doesn't seem to be prepared to learn. We want to be fixed in our attitudes and fixed in our approach. We want to look at things in black and white. If I don't like that person, whatever else happens is unappreciable. I am not going to accept it. You can't move on that basis. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to resolve any conflict in this world. Certainly not going to be able to.